education, natural science, and economics. As many of you, or perhaps all of you know, much of academic thought in the 20th and 21st centuries is shaped by, and in some cases constituted by, the distinction between facts and values. Something resembling this distinction was present in earlier thought. It was known as the distinction between what is and what is to be done, or between what is true and what is good. And these were held to be the concern of speculative and practical reason, respectively. Reason is one that has these two different employments. It supplies principles of necessity universal that guide us in determining what is and what is to be done. These principles by themselves do not always suffice to fully determine either of these things. That's where judgment comes into play. But judgment is not a free-floating mode of thought that functions independently of universal principles. It is instead, by its very nature, the application of universal principles to concrete cases. The more recent distinction between facts and values differs from the earlier distinction between what is and what is to be done, in that though reason may supply principles for inquiry into facts, it supplies no principles for inquiry into values. Given certain values, reason can, to be sure, establish connections between them, but reason is not the source of the values themselves. Values are neither self-evidently true in their own domain, nor can they be rationally and logically deduced from the domain of facts. Facts are objective, values are subjective, values are relative. They are relative to the subject who constitutes them, and an active evaluation expresses a prejudice or preference of the subject or group of subjects happens to hold. The academic distinction between facts and values has trickled down into the popular understanding. Even individuals who do not think of themselves as relativists speak of values in a way that would puzzle their grandparents. Today we hear a lot about Judeo-Christian values, Western values, family values, and so forth. Organizations advertise their core values. Parallel to this popular use of the word values, the study of avoidance by non-academics as well as academics of old-fashioned words like good and bad, right and wrong. And when the terms are not avoided, their utterance is often accompanied with twitchings of the index and middle fingers of both hands. Good, bad, right, wrong, even true, false. There's a predilection for the use of terms that are supposed to be free of value denotation. Free of the denotation of good and bad, but they carry a connotation of good and bad. Terms such as positive versus negative instead of attitudes and acts. People are urged to develop their potential, as though one's potential can only be good, as though one could not develop bad potential, such as becoming, say, a murderer. In commerce, a good mattress, for example, is advertised as a quality mattress, not as a mattress of good quality. A superior football team is said to be a class team, rather than a high-class team. The service academies are said to aim at producing military officers of character, rather than military officers of excellent character, and so forth. In the realm of facts, on the other hand, the word science, which traditionally meant demonstrative knowledge, and the word itself means knowledge, is now restricted to the study of the material constitution of things exclusively. That's what science is understood to have as its proper concern. As though the material makeup of the world within things were the only thing that's real about things. Mathematics used to be called science, as did logic. Today the word science is restricted to physics, chemistry, biology, and the like. Disciplines that are not purely demonstrative but rely on empirical induction, that is, on generalizations from experience that necessarily carry with them some tincture of uncertainty. Scientific theories are always a little bit iffy. That's why there can be progress in physics, chemistry, and biology. Progress in science involves revision and in some cases repudiation in whole or in part of earlier scientific theories that were almost universally held to be true. It is science, natural science, that is supposed to tell us what things really are. But natural science can tell us what things really are only on the assumption that reality is matter and its properties and nothing else. This assumption, however, is neither a self-evident truth nor is it a demonstrable truth, not least because it cannot make sense of its claim, explicit or implicit, to be true, truth being neither a piece of matter nor one of the known properties of matter. None of this, I hope it goes without saying, is intended as a brief against including modern natural science and liberal arts curriculum. What modern natural science has shown us about our world and how to alter our world is arguably the most spectacular intellectual achievement of the last 3.5 centuries. And I, for one, do not think there's anything in St. John's curriculum that works better for us than our lab program, what others would call our science classes. This part of the St. John's curriculum has been aptly noted as our best kept secret. And our teaching and learning lab program is also, for many of us, our most pleasant surprise at St. John's. That said, I must add, once the natural science contributes to a liberal education only when its devastating limits are acknowledged. The contemporary construal of natural science is the gold standard of inquiry into objective reality, and the contemporary construal of what is good as value, obviously pertinent to the outlook for liberal education. For liberal education was traditionally understood to be rational inquiry, aiming at an ascent from opinion to knowledge. It was unforgettably analogized by Socrates in the Republic as the ascent from the darkness and artificial light of the cave to the natural light of the sun. Today, much of what passes for liberal education aims not at ascent from the cave to the light, the existence of light, of truth, the truth, being questioned or denied outright, but at moving laterally from cave to cave, a spelunking exercise that culminates in celebrating the diverse forms of human prejudice and preference can take. Our two speakers for this session are Michael Dink and friend Pagano, both are tutors at St. John's College. Mr. Dink is the former dean of the Annapolis campus. Mr. Pagano is the former director of the Graduate Institute in Santa Fe. Their papers speak to the challenges posed to liberal education classically conceived by modern science and economics. The title of Mr. Dink's paper is Modern Science and Modern Philosophy, Siamese Twins. The title of Mr. Pagano's paper is Value and Virtue in America. Both papers will be presented before the floor is open for questions.
My paper has 4 parts: the philosophic interpretation of liberal education, Socratically understood; the place of modern science in liberal education, Socratically understood; the need to interpret modern science; and some interpretive traditions in making philosophical sense of modern science. In his magisterial historical study, Orators and Philosophers, Bruce Kimball argues that the tradition of liberal education is not a unified one, but rather is divided into 2 opposing interpretations, that of the orators and that of the philosophers, each of which has prevailed in certain periods at the expense of the other. The oratorical interpretation, traceable to Socrates, sees the goal as the development of virtuous and effective citizens, public servants, and even statesmen, and the means as learning the arts of language, particularly of rhetoric or persuasive speech. The philosophical interpretation, traceable at least as an ideal to Plato's dialogues, sees the goal as the pursuit of knowledge and the means as the learning of the arts of logic, mathematics, and dialectic. Kimball argues that the so-called 7 liberal arts of the trivium and quadrivium never formed a unitary program, but the primary, almost exclusive focus was on rhetoric in one tradition and logic and mathematics in the other. To put my cards on the table, I am an unabashed advocate of the philosophic interpretation of liberal education over the rhetorical one, although I understand the true sense of that philosophic interpretation somewhat differently than Kimball does. My reasons for rejecting the oratorical tradition are all present, implicitly or explicitly, in Plato's Gorgias, and never answered adequately by any of the advocates of that tradition, to my knowledge. First, the proposed end is contingent and dubious. It is not clear, prior to some amount of inquiry at least, that citizenship is necessarily a good or the most important good for human beings. Second, it is not clear what the virtue of a good citizen consists in. An oratorical education must dogmatically presuppose answers to these questions, as Kimball acknowledges, since it does not, as part of its enterprise, engage in inquiry into them. Third, no argument is offered for the unlikely claim that mere training in persuasive speech constitutes an education in civic virtue. Fourth, it is not clear that there is a genuine art of persuasive speech. If the philosophic interpretation of liberal education merely makes knowledge its goal, then it may, to some extent, be open to analogous objections. 1, knowledge might be regarded as a contingent and dubious good. 2, it it may not be clear that what knowledge is, or even if it exists. 3, however one might conduct a philosophic liberal education, it is not clear that it can lead to knowledge. 4, it is not clear that there is any learnable art or technique to philosophy either. Hence, if the philosophic interpretation of liberal education is not to fall prey to a similar critique to that I've given of the rhetorical interpretation, it must be based on a different understanding of the aim of a philosophic liberal education. I find such an understanding in certain aspects of Plato's presentation of Socrates. Socrates supposes, correctly I believe, that all human beings care about guiding their lives by a correct understanding of their own good. More often than not, however, they act as if they already had an adequate understanding of that good. When Socrates questions them, however, they invariably show that they do not have such an understanding, or at least are not able to articulate it. He then asks them to join with him in a common inquiry in search of such a correct understanding. This common inquiry into a correct understanding of one's own good is precisely what constitutes a genuine liberal education. It need not presuppose at the beginning that knowledge is possible or good, only that the lack of an adequate understanding of our own good is not good. In his youth, Socrates famously cherished a hope that the teaching of Anaxagoras might reveal why it was best that everything was as it is. When that hope was disappointed, he turned away from the inquiry into nature to examine the truth of things in speeches. In the Apology, we see at least one version of this inquiry through speeches, in which he takes upon himself, in response to an enigmatic reply from the Delphic oracle, the cross-examination of those who claim to know. This makes sense as a place to start in the inquiry into the correct understanding of one's own good. This is precisely the basis of the form of liberal education that focuses on the reading of great books. Those great books are read because they put forward the most significant claims to know about the human good that are available to us. They are read because we want to understand and to evaluate their claims to know, so as either to find something that will contribute to the correct understanding of our own good, or at least to have reasonable grounds for rejecting their claims. The claims that they make are significant and worthy of examination for 2 reasons. First, the fact that they have been found worthy of reading and study by many people over a long time gives them a prima facie claim to be taken seriously as possible sources of wisdom. Second, the same fact also suggests what further reading and reflection confirm, that they are the sources, acknowledged and unacknowledged, of many of our own beliefs about the human good, which need to be examined to determine how reliable they are. That examination is facilitated by tracing these beliefs to their sources, where they are often most powerfully and cogently articulated. Thus, contrary to a claim that Kimball makes later in his book, the reading of great books is not merely an accommodation of what he calls the liberal, free ideal of critical thinking to the rhetorical tradition's interest in inherited text, but it is an intrinsic part of the Socratically understood philosophical interpretation of liberal education. Part 2, the place of modern science in liberal education in its Socratic interpretation. So far, it may seem that modern science would have no place in liberal education, Socratically understood. After all, the young Socrates, disappointed in Anaxagoras' failure to address the human good, turned away from the inquiry into nature. In the Apology, the claims to know he examines are those of the politicians, poets, and craftsmen, not those who claim to have knowledge of nature or the cosmos. Yet it is not clear from the text of the Phaedo that Socrates regarded his turn away from the inquiry into nature as final or definitive. Rather, he describes his turn to speeches as a second sailing in search of cause, and compares it to studying something by examining its reflection rather than by looking at it directly. Moreover, the desire to achieve a correct understanding of one's own good inevitably leads to a concern with the distinction between knowledge and opinion, and to the consideration of whether opinions about one's own good can be replaced by knowledge. This concern, in turn, leads inevitably to a broader concern about the nature of knowledge and how it might be achieved. Hence, almost any serious claim to knowledge about any subject becomes relevant to the Socratic inquiry into one's own good. In today's world, moreover, it is modern science that makes the most prominent claim to know. So prominent that its very name is an appropriation to itself of the Latin word for knowledge, an appropriation which seems to mark an explicit claim to be the only legitimate kind of knowledge, a claim made explicit by many of its advocates. One might object, however, that modern science does not claim to know about the human good, and thus it does not belong in a liberal education conceived as an inquiry into the human good. To this, it must be replied that the claims to know of modern science are relevant to the inquiry into the human good in a number of ways. First, those who do interpret modern science as the only legitimate claim to know, and who also interpret it as eschewing claims to know about the human good, thereby declare knowledge of the human good to be impossible. This is a claim highly relevant to the inquiry into the human good. Second, even if modern science is not interpreted as excluding other avenues to knowledge of the human good, it is nevertheless hard to deny that the claims it does make, under many interpretations, alter the landscape of that inquiry in fundamental ways, threatening to undermine appeals to, for example, the human soul, teleology, freedom, human superiority to, or even distinctness from other animals. Third, by its great success in increasing human power over nature, including perhaps even over human nature, modern science intensifies the urgency of the questions about what understanding of the human good can guide and restrain the use of that enhanced power. Part 3, the need to interpret modern science. It has been a presupposition of my remarks so far that there is such a thing as modern science, which is significantly distinct from earlier forms of the inquiry into nature. This is a presupposition widely, but perhaps not universally shared. It is shared by both by those who think modern science has replaced the darkness of superstition and vain philosophy with the light of empirical reason, and by those who think that modern science threatens to strip the world of any support for a meaningful human existence. An alternative is to see the inquiry into nature as a long-standing human practice that has undergone continuous change and development in the course of human history with varying degrees, not necessarily monotonically increasing, of cognitive success. Attention to this diachronic continuity, however, or alleged continuity, I should say, should not induce us to neglect the question of syncretic discreteness. In other words, how discrete and distinct is the thread identified as the inquiry into nature at any one time in relation to other inquiries, beliefs, and cultural practices? There is a plausible case to be made, though no doubt not a definitive one, that the following cluster of ideas emerged roughly at the same time in the Greek-speaking region of the Eastern Mediterranean. One, the idea of demonstrative mathematics, the making of a clear distinction between nature and convention, as well as between knowledge and opinion, the attempt to gain knowledge of nature, and the quest for knowledge that comprehends both non-human nature and the human things, that is, philosophy. From this time forwards, there were debates about and rival answers to the question of how knowledge of nature might relate to other kinds of human knowledge, beliefs, political arrangements, and practices. One set of answers, originally given by Aristotle, kept alive by Islamic and Jewish thinkers and reconciled with their religious texts, traditions, and practices in various ways, was reassimilated in the 12th and 13th centuries by Christian thinkers who incorporated them into a theoretical synthesis with their religious beliefs. This scholastic synthesis contained a version of Aristotelian natural philosophy as the widely accepted framework for any ongoing inquiries into nature. No doubt, there were some practitioners of inquiry into nature who either ignored this framework or were beginning, more or less consciously, to chafe against it and start to wriggle free of it. Some thinkers, however, notably Descartes and Bacon, thought that radically new modes of pursuing the inquiry into nature were desirable and that the old framework was, on many levels, an intolerable obstacle to the introduction and success of these new modes. They therefore undertook the task, correspondingly multi-layered, of articulating the new modes of inquiry, critiquing the old framework, providing a new framework, and persuading many different kinds of audiences of the feasibility and desirability of abandoning the old framework permitting and even supporting the new modes of inquiry and accepting the new framework. It is, of course, a complex historical question as to what the actual effects of these efforts by Descartes and Bacon were, and to what extent the modes of inquiry now practiced by modern science were influenced by their proposed articulation, and to what extent the various competing frameworks by which we still seek to understand these modes of inquiry and how they fit into our lives were influenced by the frameworks proposed by Descartes and Bacon. While I myself am inclined to think that their influence in both respects is quite important, albeit perhaps not simply governing, the main point I want to insist upon is that the activity of inquiry into nature, in spite of and perhaps to some degree because of its tendency to claim to be comprehensive, has always stirred up questions about its proper place in relation to the rest of human activity, belief, and aspiration to know. In other words, modern science, no less and perhaps more than its ancestors, stands in need of and has had no lack of interpretations in which attempts are made to address the questions it provokes. A liberal arts study of the modern science version of the inquiry into nature must concern itself with these questions and with the interpretations that seek to answer them. To study modern science apart from them is no less fatally illiberal than the failure to study modern science at all. So in part 4, I want to discuss some interpretive traditions that have tried to make philosophical sense of modern science. While I have acknowledged that there is room for doubt about the importance of Descartes and Bacon for the development of the practice of modern science, it seems to me that there is much less room for doubt about their importance for the tradition of the interpretation of modern science. I would therefore like to sketch the roots in Descartes and Bacon of 3 strands of that interpretive tradition: epistemological, ontological, and political/moral. Embedded in the methodological account of the new modes of inquiry that they advocate are a number of epistemological claims. First, inquiry cannot begin from the everyday, common-sense interpretation of the world, and especially not from the Aristotelian philosophical codification/transformation/corruption of this interpretation. Some of the things that need to be rejected include the reality of sensory qualities, such as color, warmth, hardness, and softness, the articulation of objects into readily recognizable natural kinds and as things with properties, especially explained as composites of matter and form, the explanatory priority of life to non-life, and the explanatory power of ends in relation to living things. Second, the form which knowledge must take is that of a law of action, and in Descartes' case, this means a mathematical law of motion. Third, the method for arriving at these laws will be primarily experimental, that is, questions must be posed to nature such that experiments can be contrived whose observable results will answer the questions negatively or positively. Fourth, there is some methodological divergence between Descartes and Bacon, the former asserting the possibility of deduction from self-evident principles down to a certain point, after which experiments then become necessary, the latter insisting on extensive and methodical deduction before any ascent to axioms is attempted. The subsequent history of modern epistemology seems to flow primarily from this point of divergence, centering on the relative contribution of a priori formal deductive reason on the one hand, and observation through the senses of experimental results on the other. Emphasis on the former put one in the so-called rationalist camp, on the latter in the empiricist. Kant made an attempt at a grand synthesis, attributing the possibility of coherent experience of a law-governed world, and hence of science itself, to a priori principles of the human understanding as the synthesizers of a manifold of sensory input under the a priori forms of space and time. Apologies for that brief summary of Kant. Kant's grand synthesis was in part undermined by particular results of modern physics, for example, challenges to causality and locality in quantum physics, and challenges to the independence and uniformity of space and time and relativity. This epistemological divide had an even more dramatic version on the ontological level, but not here, I think, without the mediation of more particular Cartesian claims that went beyond the methodological ones cited above. From methodological skepticism about the categories and content of ordinary experience as the starting point of science, inevitably arise questions about the character of the objects known by modern science and the relationship of these objects to the objects of ordinary experience. Descartes' answer to this question was clearer, more radical, and more influential than Bacon's. In order to secure certainty and clarity for his new science, Descartes stipulated that its object must be that which we conceive clearly and distinctly about body, that is, extension, figure, and motion. This excluded from the object of Cartesian physics both soul and form, while reconceiving matter as nothing but extension. But since Cartesian science required a knower, as well as a known, he claimed to demonstrate the existence of a thinking substance utterly distinct from body as extended substance. Descartes drew the explicit consequence that plants and animals, and humans insofar as their motions do not differ from animal motions, must be understood as machines, that is, as complexes of matter in motion, completely understandable on the basis of the laws of motion of matter. Meanwhile, the sensory perceptions that were formerly understood as receptions of form from external objects, resembling and hence conveying information about these objects, were reconceived as modes of the thinking subject, bearing no resemblance to external objects, and only problematically understandable as effects of those objects. The ontological upshot was the separation of being into two self-contained and independent realms, one of bodies as nothing but extended shapes, causing motion in one another according to certain laws, the other of ideas or mental contents, which might also have causal relations among themselves. While Descartes himself proposed that there was interaction between these two realms at a single site within the human brain, most in the subsequent tradition abandoned this claim because of the great difficulties in giving an account of this alleged interaction. Those like Hume, who followed Descartes in regarding the ideas as the source of all evidence, found, when thinking consistently, that it was impossible to make any inference beyond the realm of ideas to the existence of a realm of bodies. Taking this bull by the horns, Kant, Hegel, and Husserl all elaborated forms of transcendental idealism in which all knowing ultimately became a knowing by a transcendental or non-worldly self of a so-called world constituted by that transcendental knower. The alternative path was to take some version of the Cartesian science of the body as the starting point and to pursue the task of accounting for everything else as merely complicated consequences of the interactions of bodies moving according to the laws of motion, where everything else includes human behavior, consciousness, and knowing. This path can be called materialist reductionism, although the conception of what constitutes the matter to which everything is to be reduced has been subject to constant revision due to developments within modern physics. There is even a question as to whether there remains any intelligible content to the notion of matter other than the object of the equations of physics. The advocates of materialist reductionism have included some philosophers, for example Hobbes, many practicing scientists, and many popularizing advocates of science. Since it is hard for most of us who are not bent on drawing out the logical consequences of prima facie untenable positions to find any of these three alternatives, dualism, idealism, materialism, acceptable, many have turned to some version of what I would call an anti-realist solution. What these various versions have in common is an epistemological starting point that denies that it is possible or perhaps even meaningful for human beings to know the way things are, or what kinds of beings there are, or what the world is really like. One well-known advocate of the anti-realist standpoint, Richard Rorty, has famously debunked the realist tradition under the rubric philosophy, the mirror of nature. Here's a rough catalog of some of the more prominent forms of what I'm calling anti-realism. Logical positivism, a slightly cleaned up version of Hume, presumes that there are entities called sense data, which are the only true givens, and that science simply consists in the development of procedures for reliably predicting which sense data will follow certain others. Instrumentalism is a more general version of this, one not committed to interpreting the field of prediction as consisting of sense data. Pragmatism emphasizes that what is predicted is not just observational results, but results that matter for our practical lives as living organisms. Wittgenstein offers a linguistic pragmatism, claiming that language, and hence any set of beliefs expressed in language, is meaningful only insofar as it functions as a practical tool. These positions restore a certain priority to the contents of ordinary experience, even though they differ as to the status of those contents. For better or worse, these anti-realist positions tend to weaken the claims of modern science to a special or unique authority. As a more effective tool for prediction, it stands on a continuum with other tools of prediction, such as ordinary non-methodical experience. It, modern science thus interpreted, no longer has any critique to offer of other kinds of beliefs, except to point out that they offer less reliable predictions than science does. If there is to be such a critique, it must come from the anti-realist philosophers themselves. To some, it seems that the superior reliability of its predictive powers still gives modern science a stronger claim to the honorific name of science, albeit stripped of its former pretensions of incorrigibility and of ontological revelation. To others, however, this predictive power is a warrant of belief not radically different from other warrants, and it seems to them that the inevitable consequence, again for better or worse, of an anti-realist interpretation is a general relativism about claims for warranted belief. Once again, Rorty is perhaps the most well-known thinker to allege this consequence. Let us now return to the third interpretive strand, the consequences of modern science for moral and political questions. This has two substrands, the political conditions and consequences of the pursuit of modern science, and the consequences of the content of modern science and its ontological interpretation for the content and status of moral beliefs. Descartes and Bacon saw themselves as confronted with a situation in which political authority was connected with religious authority, which was connected with theological beliefs, which were connected with philosophical beliefs, including beliefs about natural philosophy. They were thus understandably concerned with the consequences of seeking to promote new modes of inquiry, which would require a change of prevailing beliefs about natural philosophy. These included the consequences for themselves and for others who might pursue the new modes of inquiry, as well as consequences for the stability and order of society when beliefs understood to be foundational were questioned. They dealt with these concerns in a number of ways. First, to some extent, they attempted to conceal or to mitigate the tension between the new modes of inquiry and the current political and religious order. For example, in the Discourse on Method, Descartes claimed to be reforming only his own thoughts. He presented the world of his new physics as an imaginary one, and he claimed to provide proofs for the existence of God and the immortality of the soul on the basis of his new philosophy. Second, thinkers subsequent to Descartes and Bacon, beginning at least with Spinoza, began to argue for the possibility and desirability of the separation of religious belief and political authority, and or the separation of religious belief and natural philosophy. Hence, new modes of natural philosophy would not be a threat to religious belief, or at least not to political authority. Third, an important feature of the new modes of inquiry advocated by Bacon and Descartes was the promise that they would confer on mankind new powers over nature for the benefit of mankind and the relief of his estate. This promise was offered as an incentive not only to tolerate the new modes of inquiry, but to support them with funds and even perhaps institutions for education and research. But this very promise of conferring on mankind greater power over nature made all the more urgent the question of how to arrive at an understanding of the human good that could regulate and guide the use of this power. While modern science's promise of increased power made this question more urgent, some of the interpretations of modern science that I've been discussing seem to make the possibility of answering it more problematic. At the very least, the rejection of Aristotelian natural philosophy entailed the rejection of a kind of bridge, however shaky, between natural philosophy and moral philosophy. If man, like other natural beings, had a former nature which determined the character of his activities and their excellence or perfection, then knowledge of this former nature might provide a way of coming to know his good, understood as the excellence or perfection of his natural activities. In addition, the reductionist, materialist interpretation of modern science, if consistently adhered to, simply rules out any meaningful discussion of questions of the human good. To be sure, one might regard the bulk of modern moral and political philosophy as an attempt to avoid this consequence. Once again, it is Kant who gives a clear-eyed articulation of the dilemma and an impressive attempt at a solution. He sees the threatened incompatibility between the necessity and universality of causal connections that he sees as demanded by science and the freedom to act one way or another required by human morality. His solution involves a sharp separation of both the self and the world into phenomenal and neural aspects, the former the realm of necessity, the latter the realm of moral freedom. Unfortunately, in my view, the solution depends upon a problematic interpretation of Kant's already problematic epistemology. To the extent that the anti-realist interpretations of modern science weaken its epistemic distinctiveness and universalist pretensions, they might seem to open up a space in which to investigate questions concerning the human good. But insofar as the weakening of the epistemic claims of modern science tends toward a weakening and relativizing of all epistemic claims, the space opened up threatens to empty out of anything except the play of opinions. This rough and oversimplified survey of the philosophic interpretations of modern science reflects my own opinion that at present, none of the available interpretations is satisfactory. Hence, in my opinion, the quest for such a satisfactory interpretation remains one of the most urgent tasks of philosophy, and hence one of the most urgent subjects for liberal education. Thank you.
I used to be nearsighted, but due to the wonders of modern science, I'm now farsighted. Here we go. We were all ranked together at valuation. Men and women, old and young, married and single, were ranked with horses, sheep, and swine. There were horses and men, cattle and women, pigs and children, all holding the same rank in the scale of being, and all were subjected to the same narrow examination. Frederick Douglass. Economics has served American liberal democracy well. Without reference to moral judgment or moral shame, it has quantified the democratic aims of prosperity and equality and informed the political powers which policies to pursue to achieve these ends. Economics seems to be the one study necessary for the people and rulers of a liberal democracy. We almost do none here. Its trustworthiness stems from its development and reliance upon the notions of value. Jerry Z. Muller in Capitalism and Inequality exemplifies this honesty. Now, I don't want you to think I'm using him as a straw man. I'm just looking into his presuppositions. He's an economist and historian who, although a proponent of capitalism, exemplifies this honesty. Nevertheless reveals its inability to address the crisis of the moment. This crisis he describes as the rising economic inequality in American society, and this, in my paper, shall characterize it as the devaluation of value. This characterization is not a mere paradox, because the term is used equivocally even by economists. I argue that sometimes it means the exchange value of commodities bought and sold in the marketplace, and other times it refers to the good that draws the buyer into the market, what Karl Marx calls the use value of a thing. To speak of the pursuit of value as though it were the highest good is to propagate obscurity. Value was developed to avoid the question of the highest good of a people or individual. It transforms goods into marketplace commodities with values. This is exactly the advantage of economics. It makes determinations of value without reference to the rank of goods. Economics is a social science that is most accurate for capitalist nations willing to allow value to stand in the place of the hierarchy of good. Mueller argues that the growth of economic equality threatens American confidence in the capitalist system. This paper argues that what is happening currently is the broad discrediting of the use by the capitalist system of value for ranking people and their work. Inherent to the capitalist system, Mueller observes, is the creative destruction that allows the activities that are most valued, with the familiar result that in a capitalist economy, certain jobs, indeed whole professions, become obsolete. In the earlier crisis of capitalism, people were able to make both economic and social adjustments to the destruction. For example, in the previous greatest capitalist crisis, industrialization, when the population moved from the farm to the factory, at first women and children were used in the factories, but in the end, the greater physical strength of men proved to be more valuable to the factory owners, because it's all Mueller. Women adjusted socially and became happy homemakers to the advantage, Mueller notes, of the health and welfare of the entire family. Yet social adjustment to the current crisis of capitalism, Mueller maintains, is highly unlikely. The post-industrial economy no longer values physical strength and the capacity to labor, but instead it values first cognitive ability, quickness of mind, the ability to infer and apply patterns drawn from experience and ability to deal with mental complexity, and second, character and social skills, self-discipline, persistence, responsibility. The new valuable skills are so little like the old skills of labor that the new skills have been placed on the capital side of the labor-capital division. They are human capital. Mueller therefore sketches not merely a change in the economy, but in the virtue that makes humans worthwhile. The worker and his labor are no longer valuable, but the thinker and his knowledge are. It is no longer labor that spontaneously produces value, but self-investment or family investment in the mind of the person working in the economy. Value is not correlated to the effort of the individual, but to the social investment in her, for which she is probably not responsible. Therefore, the traditional means, equality of opportunity, that reconcile the twin roots of liberal democracy, freedom and equality, has failed in the current economy. It is not sufficient to provide equality of opportunity because the unjust social investment in children means that there is no equality in the capacity of the young to take advantage of the opportunities offered. Although equality of opportunity always meant that some people would do better than others, and therefore it always resulted in inequality, it did allow some just proportion between the free pursuit of opportunity and the resulting improvement in the social condition of the worker and his family. Because the family is the workshop in which human capital is produced, the incentives of the economy cannot now advance those who are born into disadvantaged families. He's right, this is a huge crisis. The odd fact is that a significant portion of the American population is rejecting the formation of human capital in their children. Rather than emulate those people who have successfully invested in their children, those people who read the Count of Monte Cristo to their kids from a very early time, remember that example? Rather than emulate those people, they are choosing behavior that studies show obstructs the development of human capital. They do not accept that what is humanly rational, the pursuit of happiness, is equivalent to what is economically rational, the pursuit of value. Mueller acknowledges that communal groupings, as well as the family, largely determine the economic success of its members. He refers to the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, a study that makes the case for why Protestants tended to do better economically than Catholics, and Calvinists better than Lutherans. I was a Catholic. I became a Protestant so my kids could do better. Mueller asserts that the explanations offered for such patterns are less important than the fact differential group performance has been a perennial feature in the history of capitalism. This may be true from the perspective of economic analysis. It is not true if there is a trend away from accepting value, which usually reduces to a good marketplace relationship, as a sign of a rational life. Mueller's dismissal of the investigation into the moral roots of American problems indicates that value has been transformed from a sign into a self-sufficient standard for human life. America is beset by two opposite trends. One dismisses value as an indicator of a rational life, and the other that identifies the rational life with value itself. In fact, the accumulation of capital is not always a rational pursuit. Consequently, it is of the utmost importance to know how economic value was originally understood so that it became a widespread sign for a rational life. There are two traditional and alternative justifications for regarding value as a reflection of the rational good. The first is philosophical and linked to justice. The second is theological. The philosophical justification is formulated as the labor theory of value, first set out, I believe, by John Locke. He explicitly links labor to property rights. I'm not going to read the quote, you'll have to trust me. Later in the argument, Locke connects labor to value. Quote, "It is labor, then, which puts the greatest part of value upon land, without which it would scarcely be worth anything. It is to that we owe the greatest part of all its useful products," end quote. But this is not Locke's final word on the source of value. Money revolutionizes the notion of value. Indeed, money, rather than labor, becomes the chief source of value in the social world humans inhabit. For I ask, what would a man value 10,000 or 100,000 acres of excellent land, ready cultivated and well stocked too with cattle, in the middle of the inland parts of America, I guess Ohio, where he had no hopes of commerce with other parts of the world to draw money to him by the sale of the product? It would not be worth the enclothing, and we should see him give up to the wild common of nature whatever was more than would supply the conveniences of life to be had there for him and his family. The value associated with money is not directly connected to labor or to natural right. Indeed, there are not as many good things left to others as required by natural right in nature after the effects of money are felt. Regardless of what others have, money can create an artificial scarcity that allows the notion of value to devalue labor. And since labor value is connected to right, the devaluation of labor devaluates right and justice. From the perspective of labor, money is an artifice of the mind that might break the connection between value and labor, between value and right and justice. For the laborer, allowing capital to establish the value of things is only justified if it provides plenty. Capitalism must make labor more valuable. Thus, labor rightly relinquishes its direct link to value only if, as a result, labor becomes more valuable. So, for labor's going down, we talk to the Fed, right? Property consequent upon labor is naturally right. Property consequent upon the manipulation of money is artificially right. This economic artifice is only true right if it affirms labor as the natural and true source of all value. The second justification of value, which is sometimes in tension with the first, appears in the work to which Mueller refers when he claims that a differential group achievement in capitalism is long-standing. Marx Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. It provides a theological justification linked to enlightenment. Weber argues that the Protestant notion of a calling, heightened in Calvinism by the doctrine of election by grace, generated the conditions for capitalism. The loneliness of election demanded some support for the conviction that the individual belongs to the elect. This is always hard, right, to prove. Weber explains, quote, "Totally unsuited though good works are to serve as the means of attaining salvation," i.e. what Catholics thought, they are indispensable as signs of election. In this sense, they are occasionally described as indispensable for salvation. This means, however, fundamentally that God helps those who help themselves. In other words, the Calvinist creates his salvation himself. More correctly, he creates the certainty of salvation. You can see how this hooks with Descartes. It further means that what he creates cannot consist, as in Catholicism, in the gradual storing up of meretricious individual achievements. Instead, it consists in a form of systematic self-examination, which is constantly faced with the question, elect or reprobate. Systematic self-examination demands a system of rational signs that indicate an individual has been chosen to be among the elect. For the greater glory of God, the work of the faithful should result in a rational system of signs. It is significant that wealth is not good in itself, but good only as a sign. It is an intellectual good in some sense, more than it is a material good. In the Protestant view, value is a means to a kind of self-knowledge. It is clear that the seeking of signs to be assured of election is compatible with regarding value as a conventional token of the highest good. The market gives signs of what is valuable, more or less, and the individual is free to follow the market or to ignore it. For these Protestants, wealth is not good in itself, but good only insofar as it can be evidence for the rationality of one's own work. The chief point of this discussion is that the religious virtues of piety and faith are compatible with the accumulation of capital. In the Protestant doctrines, work and the accumulation of capital serve rational reflection. Capital is regarded by Protestants as much as a kind of thinking, as a kind of labor. The accumulation of capital is not a consequence of good works, but of systematic good works. The systematic work of the faithful is an attempt to be certain that God has extended his highest providence, salvation, to a particular member of the congregation. Work is subordinate to reflection upon God's providence. Work is not related to justice. Value is not a token for a just distribution according to desert. The rise of inequality is therefore not an objection to the rationality of the Calvinist economy. Weber begins his examination of the Protestant ethic with a sermon by Benjamin Franklin. Franklin's thought secularizes Protestantism. The virtues connected to Calvinism and those required for the enlightenment Franklin proposes, however, are similar. Both have confidence in a rational providence and advocate a kind of asceticism. The emphasis in both Calvin and Franklin is on self-worth. For Calvinism, this worth resides in election. For the faith in human enlightenment, it arises from a conviction in the moral agency of the individual. Francis Bacon, one of the originators of the Enlightenment, names the virtue of self-reverence as the source of all virtue. Insofar as value stands as a sign for enlightenment as a rational good, it is connected to self-reverence, which is in turn based on the conviction that enlightened people may be free. It requires a faith in the human capacity to learn how to make rational judgments and to act on these judgments. For the free individual, rationality is compelling because it increases her self-worth. Capitalism in this view is radically dependent upon the incomparable worth of free individuals. There's no value that can describe that. Taken in its broadest terms, the same system of capitalism might be seen irrational or irrational depending upon which virtue connected to which good that value is a token for. From the perspective of justice, the value of the industrial economy of the post-World War II America was a proper standard for a just society. Labor was rewarded. By contrast, if justice must be connected to a rational economy, the present system, and therefore the present manifestation of value, are irrational. Consider the enormous effort that a family must take to accumulate human capital in their children. Reading, Dr. Seuss. 20 years of laboring by parents and child to result in a person with enough capital to participate in the current economy. And for disadvantaged families, the result of these labors is probably inadequate. Labor and justice are demeaned. This prolonged asceticism is at odds with the scheme of rewards apparent at the peak of capitalism in the world of finance. Mueller observes the structure of incentives in this environment, the peak, led fund managers, the peak of the peak, to try to maximize short-term returns, and this pressure trickled down to corporate executives. So it's a trickle-down economy. no just proportion between labor and reward. The manipulators of capital enjoy quick and gigantic rewards, many of the investors in humans, distant and little rewards. From another perspective, however, contemporary capitalism has entered into an era of increased rationalism. If we adopt the view of secularized Protestantism, then the contemporary arrangement then values the development of the mind over immediate material gratification. Value in this case is a sign of the cultivation of the mind. It is not good in itself. Like the early Protestants, successful capitalists spend their youth developing a capacity to think. The disproportionality of time spent in investing in human capital as opposed to investment of money capital is a further sign that systematic human development is worth more than financial rewards. The time is disproportionate because the investment in humans requires a faith in human development akin to the old faith in God's providence. Christians are patient because their standard for time is eternity. The middle class is patient because their standard for time is a lifetime. Value is merely a sign of what society holds as worthwhile. It is clear that significant portions of American society no longer believe that value is reliable. For those who have dropped out of the economy, value is not an indicator of personal worth, but a sign of the injustice of the current economy. These people, Miller worries, may generate a populist backlash against the capitalist system at large. By the natural standard of labor value, the system is unjust, and some remedy needs to be found. Mueller suggests continuing the mixed economy with a capitalist job market and a safety net for those disadvantaged by that market. Justice must be found elsewhere than in the economic marketplace. I think this just discredits the justice of capitalism if this is true. Yet capitalism is in a deeper crisis yet, since a significant portion of the American population, including those who have successfully navigated the system, taking their cues from the managers of money, believe value to be the rational good. A greater crisis of capitalism is coming since value, which is only a sign that stands in for the rational good, is believed to be the rational good itself. Human worth then is merely a financial calculation. Economic valuation determines that the disadvantaged are worthless and the rest of the population are servants to the caprice of value ungrounded in human worth. Capitalism in such an event is merely nihilism that appears in disguise as a rational and systematic organization of the world. The destruction of human worth as a real phenomenon will end all possibility of creative human effort. I'm cutting. The best solution to the crisis in capitalism is one that brings together the traditional supports of capitalism, the free pursuit of enlightenment and justice. But Mueller notes that American public policy cannot pursue these together. This paper has pointed to the fact that his double approach does not address the root of the problem, the discrediting of value. Capitalism demands that humans exercise their capacity to be moral agents and to develop their worth freely. The obvious single way to restore confidence in capitalism is to reconnect it to justice together with enlightenment. For the disadvantaged, this restoration could be achieved directly if skilled labor again were connected to value. Yet even if America is able to return to the supports that natural rights and the labor theory of value first supplied capitalism, in an era of the devaluation of value, it must strengthen the support that enlightenment supplies capitalism. A renewed enlightenment is a more radical demand because it conflicts with the conventional wisdom of the relation of economics to the public good. And this is the point of the whole paper. The new enlightenment requiring economic analysis cannot be accepted as trustworthy without an understanding of how economic prudence affects the freedoms of the citizens. American history shows that some Americans knew very well how to produce free humans in the face of the devaluation of value. For instance, there is no greater argument for the sometime viciousness of value than the lines from Frederick Douglass that are at the top of this paper. Values serve the conventions of society. When the conventions are bad, value is as well. Douglass outlines 3 steps to self-reverence in the face of evaluation serving injustice. He first learned to read, and he thanked the vagabond boys in Baltimore for teaching him that. And then he used that freedom to read in order to read speeches about freedom, specifically Irish freedom. And finally, he acted upon that knowledge of freedom. Few people have the intelligence and courage of Frederick Douglass, so that he hardly seems to serve as a guide for a general revival of personal worth. Still, Frederick Douglass had an advantage over Americans whose prejudices accord with the social conventions that value stands in for. Douglass knew that in his time value served injustice. Against the common usage, much of this paper has argued that value is no longer connected to justice. In the post-industrial economy, it is indifferent to justice and to the importance of moral agency altogether. Douglass also knew that freedom required education. His first assertion of freedom was learning to read. The case of the slaveholder, however, and this is what's important, is altogether different. He was oppressor and oppressed at once. His conventional education served his prejudices and made him vicious. One of the main arguments of the narrative is that slavery kept the slaveholder ignorant and made him bad. His apparent virtues were vices. Accordingly, the narrative is a work written primarily for the benefit of the slaveholder. He, the slaveholder, had an opportunity to educate himself liberally by reading Douglass's narrative. Contemporary America seems very far from the situation of antebellum America. If education was then the vehicle of justice and freedom, it now seems to be the means for maintaining economic inequality. Indeed, Miller insists that education is not a panacea. In contrast, this paper has developed the argument that the problem of capitalism requires re-educating the nation. The disadvantage of taking their understanding of capitalism from the apparent irrationality of the relation between the struggle to create human worthiness, called economically human capital, and the reward for that struggle, if the true reward, which is liberty, is described in terms of value. It is a mistake to judge in terms of value the liberation that real education offers the individual. It is a mistake that almost every American makes, including Meg McConnell. Americans think as though they are economists even when their actions do not involve economic reality. But it's the virtues linked to freedom that give people their worth. When capitalism acknowledged this truth, it liberated people. When it ignored this truth, it ceased being true capitalism. Yet if ignorance makes people oppressor and oppressed at once, liberal education makes them liberated and liberated at once. All true education is a kind of rebellion, a rebellion against prejudice. Americans need to rebel from the tyranny of value. Value is not always equivalent to justice, and it is not necessarily equivalent to enlightenment. It is usually equivalent to conventional wisdom. Value is an honest servant only when understood as a sign of the conventional order. The conventional order needs moral analysis, that is, analysis in terms of a community of free agents. Economic terms like human capital need restatement in terms of freedom. If human capital stands in for the effects of the Enlightenment on the economy, then that moral analysis must stand alongside the economic characterization so the citizenry might know what effect the new terms indicate morally. Capitalism in the current era needs the support of liberal education. Capitalism is dynamic and therefore the threats to Americans as free agents are always in flux. Since value reflects thoughtless human choices, thoughtless with respect to their effects on freedom, the need for liberal education is constant and unrelenting. It is their prejudices that people value, and they need to confront them rather than disguise them as value. How will this liberal education help the disadvantaged who, according to economic analysis, are not able to take advantage of it? When the terms of the problem are changed, the terms of the solution change. The problem is a matter of self-worth in an economic order that does not supply the means to gain this self-worth. The pressing problem is how to devise a public policy into our articulate a justification of this policy that supposes that Americans have the capacity and desire for freedom. Obviously, policymakers and teachers should have a liberal education so that they can see the social problem for what it is. Capitalism needs liberal education because the spirit of capitalism is a consequence of the enlightenment of the free human. Capitalism can only be free activity if there are free, enlightened individuals. The free individual knows he should not be a slave to prejudice. Many contemporary American prejudices are phrased in economic terms that give to prejudice the disguise of science. To listen only to what one already believes is the surest way to be a slave to prejudice. Enlightened humans study the human world, those parts that are familiar and those that are strange, those that are current and those that are bygone. This call to liberal education may seem to be misplaced 17th century Protestantism, yet the virtues that created capitalism did not arise out of capitalism. They created capitalism only as a social sign of enlightenment and justice. Enlightened capitalism is a sign of the moral agency of human freedom. Economic progress in a capitalist nation rests upon the enduring freedom of individuals. For this freedom to persist, the individuals of a nation must be enlightened. It is a sign of the depth of the current crisis in capitalism that much, if not all, of the discussion of liberal education is that it is not truly valuable. It is upside-down thinking to judge liberal education in terms of economic value. In fact, liberal education reduced economic value. Economic value should be judged in terms of moral freedom. By its own terms, capitalism is endangered. Ignorant capitalism threatens the freedom implicit in capitalism. Liberal education can lift the ignorance and preserve the freedom. Still, no one knows how long the school of freedom will remain open. No one knows how long capitalism will survive. Thanks.
Very much, Mr. Pagano, Mr. Dink, the floor is open for questions.
Well, I have a question for Mr. Dink. Why do you limit the Socratic pursuit of liberal education to the study of one's own good or even human good, rather than the good simply?
It's not my intention to limit it to that. I was really only arguing for its sort of most indubitable starting point. It seems to me likely or even necessary that from that starting point, one will be led to the question of the good simply.
But I wonder whether that is the natural starting point. It seems to me that's not the first question that young people ask. Young people want to ask what's true and what's the good of all things. When Socrates approached Anaxagoras, he asked, among other things, I'll translate, why is it good that there be human beings? If you're not allowed to ask that question, if that's not the primary question, or if it's not part of the primary question, it seems to me you have a truncated beginning, which is going to lead to a truncated whole.
I guess I'm more confident than you are that one will get there, right, from starting with.
But I still question whether that's the natural starting point. It seems to me, even when you talk about one's own good, it seems so economic, as it were, almost. It doesn't seem ultimate enough. It doesn't seem true to the character of young human beings.
If I understand you, you're saying, do I understand you to be saying that a young human being is more likely to ask, what would it be like to live a good life, and what is my own good?
Yes.
I agree.
Well, I don't
But
see
also,
those, I see those as different forms of the same question, but, it seems to me, I don't mean to restrict the meaning of one's own good in the way you seem to be thinking that formulation restricts it, right? I agree there maybe you're right that natural beginning is wider, more generous.
Or in Mr. Carey's terms, the good life isn't understood primarily or originally as just one's own good. In fact, it's much larger than one's own good, and even larger than human good. I mean, the ecological movement can't be understood if one restricts oneself to even the human good, let alone one's own good.
Well, again, I didn't necessarily mean that the starting point would remain the standard, right? I'm not saying that that's the standard that will continually judge the kind of answers that you come up with. But I take to heart the question of whether there's a danger in this way of framing the beginning.
You had a question?
Well, and this question sort of is a different perspective on that one, which is I teach at a science and engineering school, and all of the young humans that I see, this is sort of a question that relates to how these papers might speak to each other. The young humans that I see, when saying, why do you want to be an applied scientist? The answer is to make a lot of money. This is the #1 response that I ever get. I wish they were saying, how do I live a good life? But this is not what it is. And so I'm wondering, how might either of you say the liberal arts can speak to that impulse that I get from, here's the good of science and engineering is economic.
How much money would you take to eat your parents? That's the response. That's the in Herodotus, to show the relativity of they call in people, and one people eats their parents and one people burns them. And
It's all alternate day.
right. But so if money is it and it has no moral quality to it, then you should be willing to do anything for money. And being an applied scientist probably isn't enough. You probably make more money doing something else. Just think of the possibilities. Vice pays better than virtue.
There's some question as to whether the prime motivation of engineering and applied science students is just money. Some of them are actually interested in why things work the way they do.
The question is whether, it sounds like from her experience that they don't, if that's true of themselves, they often don't understand it of themselves.
Exactly. So it takes some trick to get them there. So I agree that they might end up there, but initially it's rarer.
Yes.
Thank you for your talks. This question is for Mr. Dink. You talk about how we don't have any clear way of trying to solve moral or political issues when it comes when we use other sciences or some interpretation of it. I was puzzled always by why we left the Aristotelian thought. Because it seems that there is no much of criticism to it as much as like, let's try to do something new and different, and this gives us power, and let's just fly with that. I don't know, I was wondering if you could elaborate more on what kind of criticisms Descartes or other people present to Aristotle, and what you think about those criticisms, and why we shouldn't be able to do something like this to try to harmonize modern mechanics with some teleology.
It's a good question. I think Descartes thought that that all of the Aristotelian understanding of things was a hindrance to this new scientific approach in order to gain power over nature for our benefit. Whether or not there's some way to harmonize modern science and its practical achievements with some elements of the Aristotelian understanding. Right? seen a viable form of it myself. I mean, it'd be a long, I don't think I can say exactly where I part ways with Leibniz, but.
Yes.
I am curious to know, along those lines, the acquisition of power over the natural world for the human good, where does the inquiry into the limits of that fit into both the sort of critique of the understanding of science and of capitalism? And I'm thinking particularly of a text like Ivan Illich's Energy and Equity, in which he talks about the environmental problem of energy is framed. It's always framed as, how do we get all this energy that we need, but not have it blow back in our faces and wreck the system? And he says, we're operating on the assumption that we need to enslave. We need to have these energy slaves. They're not human slaves anymore, but machines that do these things for us. But the question is, and he takes a particular example of speed. At what point does increasing speed begin to become counterproductive to human freedom? So that he sees us, on the one hand, he saw underdeveloped countries as being trapped in a situation where there wasn't enough speed. They were bogged down. But he's trapped in a world of speed so excessive that it's inherently destructive of equality. Is that part of the same kind of analysis that we're thinking about here?
It sounds like he has some idea of what a good human society is, right? And that there are.
Well, he's particularly trying to say that it's a political question. It's a question of what is a good human society to determine. He says literally, what is the speed limit? How fast do you allow the fastest things to go before the inherent inequality of that begins to feed back?
The guy here is Bacon. He sets up a society that has an underground laboratory, and then it has a surface political world. And he has some confidence in it. He doesn't spell it out that A, the scientists will show good sense not to bring forward inventions that are destructive, and B, that human freedom will adjust and limit anything that might destroy human freedom, but it doesn't elaborate. And the work is intentionally incomplete. What you're pointing out is that what Bacon didn't work out, Locke did, but unfortunately, I think the way Locke worked it out removes some of those restraints, so that scientists now are driven by money, and a lot of them, and so that economics, the economic addition to the scientific project, I don't think has been worked out properly. So I think the answer to your question is, it's experimental, we'll see, but maybe we'll mess it up.
Mr. Butler?
This is just a follow-up to that, I guess, and I think you can answer what I'd like to ask. Does the new revolution of technology beyond the Industrial Revolution and the questions of speed put us in a realm where questions have to be framed differently? Do we need to do another way of saying, should we be studying something of the 20th century to engage these questions? I think you gave a case that we can understand them from the Protestant Revolution. But it seems to me they're very difficult. The prejudices you spoke about are very difficult to see in those lights because we take them for granted. I guess I'm curious about your thoughts about how we, what kind of economic education is necessary for questions of freedom.
But what I used his presuppositions, I didn't want to use them to straw man. But what became obvious to me is the distinction between labor and enlightenment is very badly worked out. That we're leaving it to the marketplace to make these kind of distinctions. And in the old world, we had where these distinctions, the practical versus the theoretical, would be very well worked out. Economics doesn't work it out very well, and so that that kind of thought about what is the relationship between free labor, free activity, and free thought, I think is very badly worked out in economic thought. Obviously, that seems to me one of the great things that liberal education needs to do. What is the relationship between free activity and free thought? Now, Kant keeps on coming up because I think he's the last person who tried to make the Enlightenment work. All the other people, and someone like Nietzsche, tried to overthrow it. And what's happened to the social sciences anyway is through Weber is that Nietzsche has become a very prominent case. So the social sciences don't seem to be working to make the Enlightenment work. And if the Enlightenment doesn't work, then all kinds of liberty are in question. So I think that's the job of the college. It's one of the reasons that we shouldn't judge the college in terms of value. The college has to rethink economics.
Yes.
So kind of following up from that, Mr. Pagano, you said economic freedom depends upon enlightenment through liberal education. And I just wonder how you face the conundrum that liberal education, certainly in the US and more often now in Europe as well, is not economically liberal whatsoever. And the condition of many students, it's not free. And the condition of many students when they graduate, therefore, is actually a condition of economic slavery today. So how do you answer that conundrum?
I'm glad you asked this question. Because I am the proponent that we should not charge tuition. That is the conclusion you draw. We make a
I
mistake.
agree, but how would that possible?
Well, that's what advancement officers do. I'm glad that the dean from Annapolis is here, but that, I think one of the conclusions you draw is that you don't charge tuition. That is, as soon as you do that, you subject the college to the marketplace. And I think it's a
But
mistake.
that means you have to persuade some sector of the 1% to pay for it.
But actually, I think there's an alternative, that's a 100-year plan to become tuition-free. Build the endowment little bit by little bit, invest it properly, reserve it for that, because we'll eventually be subject to federal regulations as to what we teach, and we'll have the terrible situation where people who want this education can't leave it without being enslaved to debt. I think that can be done, but it has to be done deliberately and over a very long period, and we won't benefit from it, but a future generations might.
Exactly.
But that's an incredibly noble aim, but it's still one institution amongst many whose aim is not actually to build things down, but is to build them up. I mean, that's what's happening in the university marketplace in the US and again, more frequently in Europe, to build up the university, to create capital campaigns, to finance structures that then need more revenue to support them as the university goes forward. And it seems much harder to shrink the ever-expanding building, ever-expanding university and college than it does to cap it at a certain size.
Yes.
25 years ago, the foundation that apparently helped support this conference, the Development Foundation, was critical, highly critical of the undergraduate program for its deficiency in addressing economics and a system for allocating scarce goods. They noted that Marx was on that program, but they did not see von Mises or anyone who was an advocate for free market capitalism as opposed to centralized planning. I don't know if that criticism is valid. I know that it really fell in, the response to them was, what will you be now in order to make room in cab? And,
Hopefully we'll leave out Adam Smith, which we do read.
yes, I understand.
Or read Locke. Or do read Cat and
Has anything more been done in 25 years to address free market system than Adam Smith?
Not in terms of adding anything to the reading list, no.
It isn't ancient.
Yes, Mr. Slade.
Is there anything you can suggest reading in your curriculum addresses the kind of problems that you're addressing. Two different problems, the two of you. They're both very current problems. Is there anything in your curriculum that more directly addresses those problems, that you can ask the students to read and bring them directly to the floor? There are elements in the various people you mentioned, but they're pretty far from the direct confrontation you're proposing.
Well, maybe if I can interject, I think Husserl's Crisis is a text we've read from time to time that does speak at least to the issue of natural science and its relationship to a more immediate foundation, which he calls the life world. And frankly, I think Husserl's an important philosopher for St. John's because this issue of truth, which matters to me, and the idea that there's such a thing as the truth, implies to say that the truth is to be discovered, and there, whether we discover it or not, has certain implications that people regard as theological and that troubles them. And a lot of people, and I think some of my colleagues, more inclined to deny that there's such a thing as the truth and follow up on those implications. But there's also a notion that the truth is constituted by a function of the human mind, a function at a level that's not private. And Husserl's very impressive on that, as Kant is in his own way. But the notion that there's such a thing as absolute truth, but it's not a matter that's independent of human thought, is a view of things that I think a lot of my colleagues would find quite congenial, and we should explore more as a community. That's my view. So that's one thing that I would point to as people with some concerns. Mr. Dink raised, he had reservations about idealism, but maybe try to say what those reservations are. I have some myself.
Did I talk about another book?
Yeah, we'll go ahead.
Let me off for now.
I would say Go Down Moses addresses what I was concerned with. Now, it does it in two ways. One thing about Go Down Moses is it's not an economic track. So therefore, you get to see immediately that the science of economics may not be the definitive approach to it. The second of all, Go Down Moses, Ike fails to rectify a deep injustice, which includes incest and all kinds of things, by giving people money. You see it again and again and again. He fails again and again and again. I think that book is a critique of most of economic theory that thinks that money can do it. Now, what would replace it? I mean, I guess we're trying to think of what would replace it. I mean, people have to live. You know? And I'm not sure that that's what we're up to. You know, teaching. That's why I think we should be out of the marketplace, because I'm not sure that when they come out of the college, they should say, okay, so now I should make, you know, $75,000 because of how much the college costs. I'm not sure that's what we're up to. And if we say that's what we're up to, I think we're distorting what we're really up to, which is to show what really is just and right.
If I could just add a footnote, part of my question was based on the title of this panel, which was the challenges to liberal education. One of the challenges was economics. And I thought maybe the challenge is how do you build into our liberal education the subject of economics? And certainly from somebody from the point of view of Mellon Foundation's representative, we did not sufficiently address the free market system or arm our students to be able to do economic analysis, not simply cost benefit, but as Thomas Sowell would say, to identify the unintended consequences that come from economic decisions.
Right.
And to build those into the mixture of thought and decision making as they need to make economic decisions.
I would say we do. I would say that, first of all, we set up through Smith and then Marx the economic questions. But then the way in which we do it is to say they don't have to be approached as though academics were definitive science, but rather look at these other things that tell us about. I mean, the critique which Frederick Douglass does in that paragraph of value is the greatest critique I've ever heard of it. He does it in 3 lines. That's liberal education.
Yes. Yes, you.
I have a question I hope addresses both of your papers. It's about the enlightenment thinkers, Descartes and then Locke. So in the discourse on method, Descartes talks about how we can create medicine and relieve man's estate and stuff. And so he is concerned about the human good to the extent that he wants to raise the floor beneath which people don't have to sink any longer. And he says, he seems confident that this will actually make it, it'll solve some of the problems of the mind too. He says that the medicine will solve some of the deficiencies in our thinking. And I think, Mr. Pagano, you mentioned that Locke, I mean, he clearly was aware of the possibility of destroying value from justice. And, that's definitely very much present there. But they were clearly not totally naive about like what could be the ultimate consequences of the change that they were trying to bring about in the world. But were they simply overconfident that somebody would come up with a solution to any problems that came up, or did they not anticipate some of the developments that we're seeing now?
Good question. I don't, I mean, clearly I think, as Mr. Pagano has indicated, he knows this side of Bacon better than I do, that Bacon thought more, it seems, from what we can see from the writings, than Descartes did about possible dangers of the consequences of the powers that he was unleashing. And it also seems right that capitalism and industrialization have magnified the powers and hence the dangers of modern science, and that perhaps Bacon and Descartes did not anticipate that magnification. I'm not sure.
They were risk takers. They really were. Bacon especially was clear-sighted about what could go wrong. But just what I'm interested in, it isn't global warming, it's incest. And that Bacon does not have in the New Atlantis an incest prohibition. That he's very aware of it, and it's not clear that he expects modern society to perpetuate that prohibition. Well, start thinking through what the lifting of the incest prohibition means for humans as we think of them. And yet, it looks like he was willing to take a risk of it. Well, then, it seems to me that he's a big risk taker, I'd say, for Bacon. So, I don't know how big a risk they were willing to take.
Question back there.
Oh, I beg your pardon, please.
Hi, guys. So I didn't go to a liberal arts college. I went to a vocational school to learn how to do stuff like this. But I've been watching these talks, and it seems like the common question, the common theme is, how do we maintain the value of liberal arts education, and how do we teach students how to live a good life versus seek money? And one thing that I keep thinking about is, you guys seem to be approaching it from the arena of the liberal arts college, and I would think that, when I went to high school, I went to Santa Fe High, and in Santa Fe High there was a program called Academy for Communication Arts and Technology, and in that program I learned about media literacy, and that gave me the tools to see what mass media is doing to try to get me to buy into the, kind of typical capitalism type of things. Like, you want a nice car, you want to go to McDonald's, you want these nice things. And I feel like one of the most effective places you could actually make these changes and teach kids how to seek a good life versus, seek money, like you were saying. Not that money doesn't provide a good life, but it's not everything, obviously, right? Is to give kids, as they're going through these formative years, the tools to see through these what popular culture and magazines and TV and the internet now, Facebook, is teaching them. And so I don't know what you guys can do from this arena. Obviously, this is a specific arena, and you can't reach out to high schools, you can't reach out to grade school. But I keep going, from my perspective, I keep going back to, get them while they're young, and address the issues as they're developing, instead of getting these already formed brains that have already, been so affected by the world, and they get to you when they're 18, and they've already, now you're trying to kind of reverse engineer. You're trying to go, okay, here's where we go from here. So I don't know what you guys can do, or if you guys even consider doing that. I love the idea of no tuition. I think that's great. But, for me, it seems, how do you change the kids while they're young? How do you change the perspectives so they're more geared to receive this type of education and can appreciate it from the beginning, instead of having to spend time trying to teach them how to even appreciate this type of education?
It's a very good question. It seems by the time students are high school seniors that there are very few who show an interest in the kind of liberal arts education that we offer, right? The question is, how did that happen? Right? Why did that happen? Are only some people likely to develop such an interest, or does it have something to do with our educational and societal systems? Mr. Pagano pointed out the whole business of investing in your children as social capital, right? I mean, that the well-off parents these days are often, from the beginning, right, investing in their children in the sense of giving them the tools, not the tools to critique things, but the tools to get ahead, right? And so that even, I don't repeat that. So it seems to me there is, how do you break that? And on the other hand, there are the less well-off students often either simply don't find the enterprise of education attractive, or it doesn't seem worthwhile to them. Or they haven't been given even the most basic tools, right, when they were children, to be able to engage in it in a profitable way once they get to it.
Part of it is form and substance in the high school level. My wife, a graduate student, was sent here by Colorado, sent 10 teachers a year down here for graduate students. And go back and use the seminar forum with her students, rearrange the desks and the chairs, and to have conversations, and then to add the content and the substance to it, even if it were the Touchstone program that some tutors have developed or something. But it ended with students, some who never participated in class, participating and enthusiastically saying, no one in high school class has ever asked me my opinion. And they were discussing serious things and serious work. I went to Montana for a weekend, and Mortimer Adler Idea Project led seminar, first for high school teachers and superintendents from all over Montana over a weekend, but ended with the 6th grade class coming in who had read out loud in class for several leader. They were led through a 7-hour conversation on Hamlet, and it had to be cut off in an hour and a half. And it began with getting the storyline straight, block first by going around, and the students call each other Mr. and Miss, to have some distance. And their name placards. But then saying they started correcting each other before they got once around the circle about what came next as far as plot. But then the opening question was Hamlet crazy or pretending to be crazy, or what does it mean to be crazy anyway? And they took off. So it is possible to do these things at high school and those sorts of things, and who have an appetite for this kind of education.
A lot of us become educators, and I think having this kind of education helps us understand the value of that and come back and want to do it at all sorts of levels. So such a high percentage of us end up back, and maybe that's the best.
That's the best way.
Yeah, we can do.
Mr. Bradley?
I think perhaps ironically, there's also a page we can take out of multicultural education. I have a colleague working in the state of Montana who's devising Socratic seminars for Native American Indian education for all mandate under state law. Every student, high school student in the state of Montana is supposed to know something about the history with Native Americans. There's eight tribes in Montana, not unlike New Mexico. This is a very important issue. But the clue from multicultural ed is we need to realize these kids have lots of justice issues. They have lots of questions, but no forum in which to bring these up and ask them. So the program that my friend has put together involves looking back at treaty documents, looking back at foundational documents to this relationship that speaks to their cultural interest and their sense of justice, and then provides them with an opportunity to begin to ask these kinds of questions. As an educator, I have a little bit of wiggle room to do things in a school that may not meet with the form of test preparation. But I as programs like this become available, whether it's touchstones or something like this particular Socratic approach to Native American issues, those are really helpful. But what I bump into the most is there's the lack of structures for dialogue. I find among teachers and among students, when you present them with the opportunity for dialogue, you get this initial response of surprise because, some students and teachers both aren't sure how to react at first, how to create structures for dialogue. They're not already there, even though maybe we got rid of No Child Left Behind and replaced it with the new standards. I'm fishing for the name, but they're calling for critical literacy, and we can do that if we can present a program in the right way. It's actually, there's standards out there to make an opening for teachers to do this if they realize how to do it. If we can invite more teachers to come in and learn how to do this, I think there's a huge need and opportunity, perhaps. And one more thought, a few years ago I had the opportunity to speak to a 21st Century Skills Steering Committee, and I found that, I talked about, are we willing to ask students what excellence means to them on a level that's not just some number on a piece of paper? Teachers are horrified by being slaves to the testing system, and yet how to get out of that box. We could talk about excellence. What does excellence mean to a 15 or 16-year-old? It means a lot. And yet, how do we create a forum for that? When I bring up issues like that, people want to be able to have that conversation, but they don't even know how to start it. And we're in this weird place of lacking a structure to have a dialogue, but there's I think a palpable desire among people to want to have this articulated for them somehow, and there's a role we need to play in all of this. To bring these tools to people, I think.
I don't know if this is, if there's something occurring after this. So we were supposed to stop at 10:30, 10:15. My apologies.